I knew my marriage was dead the second my wife Maggie jerked away from my touch like I'd burned her. We were on the couch, I reached for her shoulder, and she recoiled with visceral disgust, eyes glued to some cooking show like I didn't exist. That reflex told me everything. She found me repulsive now, and she wasn't even trying to hide it. Right there, I, Alex Reed, made my decision. I wasn't going to beg or ask what went wrong. I was done being invisible, and she was about to find out what that meant. That Tuesday evening in our Denver home marked the exact second I stopped being a husband and became a science experiment in my own marriage. We were sitting on the couch, the same leather sectional we'd picked out together 4 years ago, when we still laughed about stupid things and made plans for a future that felt solid. I reached over, nothing dramatic or demanding, just laid my hand on her shoulder the way I'd done 1,000 times before. Her reaction was instantaneous and devastating. Maggie didn't just move away, she actively shook my hand off, like I'd placed something disgusting on her, something repulsive that needed immediate removal. The gesture was so automatic, so practiced, that I knew this wasn't the first time she'd felt that way. This was just the first time I'd really paid attention. Her face never changed expression. She didn't apologize or acknowledge what had just happened. She just kept staring at that cooking show on the screen, while I sat there feeling like I'd been slapped across the face with reality. I didn't say anything that night. I went to bed in our room while she stayed up scrolling through her phone, the blue light from the screen illuminating her face in the darkness of the living room. I could see her from the hallway, and the small smile that played on her lips told me everything I needed to know. Nobody smiles at work emails at midnight. That's not how corporate communication works. The next morning, I found the evidence I hadn't even been looking for. I was taking out the kitchen trash, one of those mundane husband tasks that apparently I was still good for, when I saw it wedged between a coffee filter and an empty yogurt container. A crumpled yellow sticky note, the kind they keep in bowls at office supply areas. I pulled it out and smoothed it against the counter. The handwriting wasn't hers. It was masculine, confident. The letters slightly slanted to the right in that way that screams private school education and inherited money. The message was short, but loaded with intimacy that made my stomach turn. Thanks for yesterday. Talking with you feels different. Good different. The initials at the bottom were KH. Those initials didn't require a detective agency to decode. Clayton Hayes had joined Maggie's marketing firm about 8 months ago, right around the time my wife had started developing a sudden passion for strategic planning sessions that ran until 9 at night and weekend team-building exercises that I was never invited to observe. I'd met him once at a company picnic, one of those forced social events where everyone pretends to enjoy undercooked hamburgers and warm potato salad. He was younger than me by maybe 5 years, had that gym-sculpted look that comes from having both time and money to invest in personal training, and possessed the kind of easy charm that made people gravitate toward him without effort. I'd watched him work the crowd that day, noticed how Maggie's laugh became higher and more frequent when he was nearby, how she touched her hair more often and stood differently, her body angled toward him even when she was supposedly engaged in conversation with someone else. I didn't confront her about the note. Confrontation requires energy and investment, and somewhere deep in my gut, I knew that this marriage was already dead. I just hadn't admitted it to myself yet. Instead, I folded the note into a small square and threw it back in the trash where she'd left it. If she wanted to be careless with evidence, that was her choice. I was done playing detective in my own life. The days that followed had a strange quality to them, like watching a movie where you already know the ending, but you're stuck in the theater anyway. Maggie moved through the house with practiced efficiency, maintaining the surface appearance of normalcy while creating an invisible barrier between us that grew thicker each day. We spoke about logistics, who would pick up groceries when the utility bills were due, whether we needed to call the plumber about the guest bathroom sink. We never spoke about us. There was no us to speak about anymore. Then on a Thursday evening, everything shifted. Maggie came home with an energy I hadn't seen in months. Her cheeks were flushed, her movements quick and animated as she dropped her leather work bag on the kitchen counter. She was holding a cream-colored envelope, expensive cardstock, the kind that corporations use when they want to impress. She waved it at me like it was a winning lottery ticket, announcing that the Ridgeview Crown Gala was happening next Saturday and that the whole executive team would be there. Partners were expected to attend, she informed me, already pulling out her phone to scroll through something, probably dress options. Partners. That word hung in the air between us, loaded with irony. I was a partner in name only, a prop she could wheel out for social occasions to maintain the illusion of stability and success. The perfect accessory to complement her carefully curated professional image. She continued, finally looking up at me, saying she needed me there because it was important for her career, and everyone brings their spouse. For just a moment, I saw something in her eyes that might have been nervousness, maybe even a flicker of guilt, but it vanished so quickly I could have imagined it. There it was. The transactional nature of our relationship laid bare. She needed me for optics, for the performance of having a devoted husband who supported her ambitions. The fact that she hadn't touched me voluntarily in months, that we'd had maybe 3 genuine conversations since New Year's, that I was essentially a live-in roommate who paid half the mortgage, none of that mattered. What mattered was the image, the facade, the carefully constructed narrative she was selling to her colleagues and superiors. I should have said no right then. I should have told her to take Clayton as her date, since he was clearly the one she actually wanted to be seen with. But I didn't, because in that moment I realized something that changed everything. This gala wasn't just an opportunity for her to parade me around like a trained SEAL. It was an opportunity for me to take back some control, to stop being passive in my own humiliation. If she wanted me there for appearances, I'd give her appearances, just not the ones she was expecting. I told her I'd be there, keeping my voice neutral. Her relief was palpable and insulting in equal measure. She actually smiled at me, a real smile, the first one in weeks that was directed at me rather than her phone screen. She thanked me, saying this really meant a lot, and then she was gone, heading upstairs to probably text Clayton about her successful manipulation of her oblivious husband. I stood in the kitchen for a long time after she left, feeling something cold and clear settle into my chest. It wasn't anger exactly, though anger was definitely part of it. It was more like a decision crystallizing, hardening into something unbreakable. I'd spent 6 months being invisible, being dismissed, being treated like I was an inconvenience in my own marriage. That was ending. Saturday night at the Ridgeview Crown, that was where it would end. The week leading up to the gala passed in a strange slow motion. Maggie was almost giddy with anticipation, spending hours on the phone with friends discussing what to wear, getting her hair done at an expensive salon downtown, even buying new jewelry that she charged to our joint credit card without mentioning it. She talked constantly about who would be there, which executives she needed to impress, how this event could impact her trajectory in the company. Clayton's name came up often, always in a context that was meant to sound professional, but rang hollow. She mentioned how Clayton thought they should pitch the rebrand differently, how Clayton suggested some amazing restaurant they should try for the client dinner, how Clayton had this theory about market positioning that was really innovative. I listened to it all with a kind of detached fascination, like I was studying a creature in a zoo. This was who she'd become, or maybe who she'd always been, and I'd just been too blind to see it. Either way, the woman I'd married, the woman I'd thought I'd spend my life with, she was gone. In her place was this ambitious, calculating stranger who saw people as tools to advance her agenda. Saturday arrived with the kind of crisp autumn weather that Denver does so well. Clear blue skies, a hint of cold in the air that promised snow in the coming weeks, leaves turning gold and red on the trees lining our street. It was the kind of day that should have felt full of possibility. Instead, it felt like the day of an execution. The kind where everyone knows what's coming, but goes through the motions anyway. I spent the afternoon preparing with military precision. I'd had my suit cleaned earlier in the week. The charcoal gray one that Maggie had always said made me look dangerous in a good way, back when she still noticed what I wore. I shaved carefully, paying attention to details, making sure every line was sharp. I styled my hair differently than usual, using product to sweep it back in a way that felt more aggressive, less domesticated. When I looked in the bathroom mirror, I saw someone I barely recognized. Good. That was the point. Maggie was in the master bedroom getting ready, her domain that I'd been increasingly excluded from. I could hear her moving around, the sound of drawers opening and closing, the hiss of hairspray, the click of heels on hardwood. When she finally emerged, I had to admit she looked stunning. She'd chosen a deep emerald dress that hugged every curve, with a neckline that was sophisticated but suggestive. Her dark hair was styled in loose waves that cascaded over her shoulders. Her makeup was perfect, smoky eyes that made her look mysterious and confident. She dressed like this for someone, just not for me. She asked how she looked, doing a small turn in the hallway. It was the most direct interaction we'd had all week. I told her flatly that she looked like she was trying to impress someone. The comment landed exactly as I'd intended. Her smile faltered for just a second before she recovered, saying it was a formal event and everyone dresses up. I agree that yes, everyone does. The drive to the Ridgeview Crown took 20 minutes through downtown Denver traffic. Maggie spent most of it on her phone, checking and rechecking her appearance in the camera app, sending messages to people whose names she didn't mention. I drove in silence, my hands steady on the wheel, my mind clear and focused on what was about to happen. I'd played this moment out in my head dozens of times over the past week, imagining different scenarios, different outcomes, but the core of it remained the same. Tonight, the performance ended. Tonight, we stopped pretending. The Ridgeview Crown was exactly the kind of venue that corporate America loves for these events. All glass and steel and modern elegance, with a massive ballroom that featured floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. Valet parking, a red carpet entrance, photographers capturing arrivals like this was the Oscars instead of a marketing firm's annual gala. Maggie's excitement was almost manic as we pulled up. She grabbed my hand, the first time she'd voluntarily touched me in months, and squeezed it hard. She reminded me to be charming, to smile, telling me that these people were important. Her voice was tight with intensity. These people, not us, not our marriage, not our relationship, these people. Her priorities had never been clearer. We walked in together, her hand looped through my arm in a performance of marital unity that would have been Oscar-worthy if either of us had actually meant it. The ballroom was already crowded with her colleagues, all dressed in their expensive clothes, drinking expensive wine, engaging in the kind of small talk that passes for conversation in these environments. Maggie immediately shifted into her professional persona, her smile widening, her laugh becoming musical and practiced. She introduced me to people whose names I immediately forgot, all of them looking at me with that particular kind of polite disinterest reserved for spouses at work events. I was an accessory, a +1, a box to check off on the attendance list. But I played along, I smiled, I shook hands. I made appropriate comments about the venue and the weather and how successful the company had been this year. All while watching Maggie's eyes scan the room constantly, searching. I knew what she was looking for. More accurately, who she was looking for. And then, there he was, Clayton Hayes, standing near the bar in a perfectly tailored navy suit that probably cost more than I made in a month. He was talking to a small group of people, gesticulating with a whiskey glass in his hand, clearly holding court. He had that quality some people possess, where they become the center of gravity in any space they occupy, pulling others into their orbit without apparent effort. And when Maggie saw him, everything about her changed. Her posture shifted, her breathing became slightly faster, her grip on my arm loosened. She was like a compass needle finding true north. He saw her at almost the same moment, and the look that passed between them was so loaded with meaning, so intimate and knowing, that anyone paying attention would have understood immediately what was happening. I was paying attention. The smile he gave her wasn't the kind you give a colleague. It was the smile of someone who knows you, who shared private moments with you, who's probably imagined taking that emerald dress off you. And the way she smiled back, all traces of her professional mask dropping for just a second to reveal something raw and genuine that told me everything I needed to know about where her heart actually was. The next 30 minutes were a masterclass in social torture. Maggie maneuvered us around the room with strategic precision, making sure we stopped to talk to everyone important while simultaneously keeping Clayton in her peripheral vision at all times. She was performing for two audiences: her colleagues who saw the successful professional with the supportive husband, and Clayton, who saw something else entirely. Every laugh was pitched to Carrie to where he stood. Every touch of my arm was calculated to be visible from across the room. She was using me as a prop in a game I hadn't agreed to play. I let her. I played my part perfectly, the attentive husband who was so proud of his wife's accomplishments. Because I knew what was coming. I knew the exact moment when everything would change, and I was patient. Patience is a weapon when used correctly. The moment arrived when the live band started playing. It wasn't a DJ playing top 40 hits, but an actual jazz ensemble, the kind that plays at events where people want to feel sophisticated. The music was smooth and seductive, filling the ballroom with a sound that practically demanded couples take to the dance floor. Several pairs had already moved to the center of the room, swaying together under the crystal chandeliers, playing their own versions of whatever relationships they were in. Maggie tensed beside me. I felt it in her body language, the sudden rigidity, the intake of breath. She turned to me with that smile, the one she'd been using all night, and grabbed my hand with more force than necessary. She said we should dance, but it wasn't a suggestion. It was a command disguised as a request. Everyone was watching, she insisted. It would look strange if we didn't. There it was, the truth laid bare. Not that she wanted to dance with her husband because she loved him and missed being close to him. Not that she wanted to enjoy this moment together. Just that everyone was watching and it would look strange. Our entire relationship reduced to optics and appearances and what other people might think. I looked down at her hand gripping mine, her fingers tight with desperation and demand. Then I looked at her face, at the fake smile that didn't reach her eyes, at the calculation behind her expression as she mentally cataloged who was watching us right now. And I felt something inside me, something that had been bending and straining for 6 months finally snapped clean. I said no. My voice wasn't loud, but it was clear, firm, final. Her smile faltered. She asked what I'd said, disbelief flooding her features. I repeated myself, this time raising my voice slightly, just enough that a few people near us turned to look. I told her I didn't want to dance with her. Her face went through several expressions in rapid succession. Confusion, disbelief, anger, and then fear. Real fear, because she was beginning to understand that something was very wrong, that I wasn't following the script she'd written in her head. Her fingers tightened on my hand, trying to pull me toward the dance floor through sheer force of will. She begged me not to do this, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper that barely concealed her panic. People were looking, she insisted. I shouldn't do this here, not now. I repeated her words back to her, letting my voice carry just a bit more. People were looking? That was what she was worried about? That people were looking? More heads were turning now. The couple closest to us had stopped their own conversation to watch. And oh, were they paying attention now? In these corporate social settings, drama is rare enough that when it appears, it becomes instant entertainment. I could see phones being subtly positioned, could feel the collective attention of the room beginning to shift toward us, like a wave building strength before it crashes. Maggie's face had gone pale under her carefully applied makeup. She begged me not to make a scene, and there was genuine desperation in her voice now. She asked me as her wife to please just dance with her for 5 minutes, and then we could leave. Please, as her wife. Those words should have meant something. They should have carried weight in history and mutual respect. Instead, they felt hollow, like she was invoking a title she'd abandoned the right to claim months ago when she'd started looking at another man the way she was supposed to look at me. I told her that as my wife, she should probably know that I found the note. I let the words hang in the air between us. The color that had drained from her face didn't return. If anything, she went even paler. She asked what note, her voice barely a whisper. I told her not to insult both of us by pretending she didn't know what I was talking about. The note with the initials KH, the one about how talking to her felt good different. I asked if that rang any bells. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again like a fish desperately trying to breathe. Around us, the circle of interested observers had grown. This wasn't subtle whispering anymore. This was a full spectator event, the kind of thing that would be discussed in office break rooms for months to come. And that's when Clayton Hayes, either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid, decided to insert himself into the situation. He pushed through the small crowd that had formed around us, his face showing what he probably thought was concern, but looked more like poorly concealed guilt. He asked if everything was okay, directing the question at Maggie, not at me. Like I was an afterthought, a problem to be managed, not the husband who'd been systematically erased from his own marriage. I turned to face him fully, and whatever he saw in my expression made him take half a step back. Good. He should be nervous. He should be very nervous. I addressed him by his full name, reminding him that we'd met at the company picnic, where he'd impressed everyone with his volleyball skills and his knowledge of craft beer. My voice was perfectly calm and conversational, which somehow made it worse. I told him it was funny that I'd been hearing his name a lot lately. My wife mentioned him constantly, I explained to the growing audience. Clayton thinks this. Clayton suggests that. Clayton has innovative theories. He glanced at Maggie, who looked like she wanted the floor to open up and swallow her whole. The entire ballroom had gone quiet now, or at least quiet enough that my words were carrying to every corner. The band had even stopped playing, the musicians exchanging glances and clearly deciding that this drama was more interesting than their set list. Clayton started to say something about a misunderstanding, falling back on that corporate speak that people use when they're trying to de-escalate situations they don't actually want to address. He suggested we take this somewhere private. I cut him off immediately. No more privacy, I told him. No more discretion. We were way past that. I explained that the problem wasn't that he'd written my wife a note telling her how special talking to her made him feel. The problem wasn't even that she'd kept it, brought it home, treasured it enough to read it multiple times before finally throwing it away. The problem was that she'd thrown it in our kitchen trash where I'd find it, and she hadn't cared enough to be careful. That was the problem, the casual disrespect, the assumption that I was so stupid, so oblivious, so fundamentally unimportant that she didn't even need to hide the evidence properly. Maggie made a sound somewhere between a gasp and a sob. Her hand reached out toward me, but I stepped back, maintaining distance. She begged me again, saying we could please just go home and talk about this. Her voice cracked as tears formed in her eyes. This wasn't the place, she insisted. I told her this was exactly the place. She'd wanted me here. She'd needed me here for appearances. Well, here I was, appearing, just not in the way she'd planned. I turned back to Clayton, who looked like he desperately wanted to be anywhere else. I told him I didn't blame him entirely, that it takes two people to betray a marriage. But I also told him he should know he was getting damaged goods. He wasn't getting the woman he thought he was getting. He was getting someone who would look him in the eye and lie with a smile, who would use him for whatever she needed in that moment, and who would throw him away just as easily as she'd thrown me away when something better came along. I wished him good luck with that. I started walking toward the exit. Behind me, I could hear Maggie calling my name, could hear the explosion of whispered conversations as everyone rushed to discuss what they'd just witnessed. Let them talk. Let her deal with the fallout of her choices for once. Let her explain to her colleagues and her bosses and her precious career connections why her husband had just publicly called her out for emotional infidelity at the biggest social event of the company year. I made it to the terrace before she caught up with me. The night air was cold, a sharp contrast to the overheated drama of the ballroom. I leaned against the railing, looking out at the Denver skyline, feeling oddly calm for someone who just detonated his marriage in front of an audience. She burst through the terrace doors like she'd been shot from a cannon, her face blotchy now, her carefully styled hair coming loose from whatever products had been holding it in place. All the elegant sophistication she'd cultivated for the evening was gone, leaving behind something raw and desperate. She demanded to know what I'd just done, her voice shaking with rage and shock. Did I have any idea what I'd just done in there? Did I understand what I'd done to her reputation, to her career? I let her rant. I let her pace back and forth on the terrace, her heels clicking against the stone, her hands gesturing wildly as she cataloged all the ways I'd ruined her life in the last 10 minutes. She talked about the partnerships she'd been cultivating, the promotions she'd been working toward, the respect she'd built over years of dedication and hard work. She talked about how everyone would see her differently now, how they'd question her judgment and her professionalism. She talked about gossip and rumors and how impossible I'd made her life. She talked about everything except us. She talked about everything except the marriage she'd been steadily destroying for months. She talked about everything except her part in creating this situation. When she finally ran out of steam, when her voice cracked and her accusations turned to desperate pleas, I turned to face her fully. I asked if she was done. She stared at me like I'd spoken a foreign language. Was she done? She repeated the question with incredulity. I just humiliated her in front of everyone she worked with, everyone she needed to impress, everyone who mattered for her future, and I was asking if she was done. I repeated her phrase slowly, emphasizing the words everyone who mattered. Interesting choice of words, I noted. I asked her to tell me where I fell on that list, the list of people who mattered to her. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. We both knew the answer. I continued, my voice steady and cold, telling her that for 6 months I'd watched her pull away from me. For 6 months, I'd existed in our house like a ghost she occasionally acknowledged when she needed something. For 6 months, I'd known that I wasn't her priority, not her partner, not even really her friend. I was just the guy who helped pay the mortgage and showed up when she needed arm candy for events like this. She tried to protest, saying that wasn't fair. I challenged her definition of fair. Was it fair when she physically recoiled from my touch, like I was diseased? Was it fair when she started staying late at work 3 nights a week and coming home smelling like cologne that wasn't mine? Was it fair when she brought home a love note from another man and threw it in our trash like it was nothing? Like I was nothing? She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly looking smaller despite the expensive dress and the dramatic makeup. She whispered that it wasn't like that she and Clayton never actually did anything physical. I asked her to finish that sentence. They never actually what? Had sex? I asked if she wanted a medal for not quite completing the full betrayal. Emotional affairs were still affairs, I told her. Emotional betrayal still counted. She'd given him everything that was supposed to be mine. Her attention, her smiles, her excitement about life. She'd saved all the good parts of herself for him and left me with the scraps. She was crying openly now, mascara running down her cheeks in dark streams. Part of me, a very small part that remembered loving her once, wanted to comfort her. But the larger part, the part that had been systematically ground down and dismissed for half a year, felt nothing but a cold satisfaction at finally being heard. She whispered that she hadn't meant for it to happen. It just did. He made her feel special, she admitted. He made her feel interesting and valuable, and like she mattered, not just as someone's wife, but as her own person. I asked if I hadn't done those things for her. The question hung between us. Or was the truth that she'd stopped giving me the chance to make her feel anything? I pointed out that she'd decided months ago that I wasn't enough, that our marriage wasn't enough, and instead of talking to me about it like an adult, instead of trying to fix things or having the courage to leave, she'd just checked out. She'd stayed for the convenience, for the financial stability, for the social appearance of being married, but she'd left in every way that actually mattered. She had no answer for that. We stood there in the cold night air, the sound of the city below us, the faint music from the ballroom drifting through the closed terrace doors. Everything that had been building between us for months was finally out in the open, laid bare and ugly and impossible to ignore. She finally asked what happened now, her voice small and defeated. I thought about that question. I thought about lawyers and divorce papers and splitting assets and explaining to family and friends what had happened. I thought about starting over at 41, about dating again, about learning to trust someone new. I thought about all the complicated, messy, difficult things that would come next. But mostly I thought about the fact that I'd finally stopped being invisible. I'd finally stopped accepting treatment that no one should accept. I'd finally drawn a line and stood my ground. I pulled out my phone and ordered a ride, then told her what would happen now. She would go back inside to that ballroom full of people whose opinions she cared so much about, and she would tell them that we were leaving due to a family emergency. She would apologize for the disruption. She would maintain whatever professional dignity she could salvage from this situation, and then she would meet me at the valet stand and we would go home. She asked why, genuinely confused about why she would do that. I explained this was the first test of whether she actually wanted to try to save this marriage or whether she just wanted to protect her image. If she went back in there, apologized to her colleagues for the scene, and left with me, It would show that she was finally willing to put our relationship above her career ambitions and her need for social approval. But if she refused, if she stayed in there and tried to do damage control and whisper explanations that painted me as the crazy, jealous husband, then we'd both know the truth. This marriage was over. I could see her mind working, weighing options, calculating outcomes. Even now, even in this moment, she was running the numbers in her head, trying to figure out which choice would benefit her most. The fact that she had to think about it told me everything. But finally, after what felt like an eternity, she nodded. She said, okay, she would do it. She would tell them we had to leave. She walked back into the ballroom, her shoulders squared, her head high despite the ruined makeup and the emotional devastation written across her face. Through the glass doors, I watched her approach the small group of executives she'd been so eager to impress earlier. I watched their faces change as she spoke, watched them glance toward the terrace where I stood. I watched her shake hands, accept awkward hugs, make her excuses. And then she was walking toward the exit, away from Clayton Hayes, who stood near the bar looking shell-shocked, away from the career opportunities she'd sacrificed her marriage to pursue, away from the life she'd been building that didn't include me in any meaningful way. The ride home was silent. Our driver, sensing the tension, didn't attempt small talk. Maggie sat pressed against her door, staring out the window at the passing lights of Denver, her reflection ghostly in the glass. I sat on my side, feeling the weight of what I'd done settling over me. Not regret exactly, but a kind of solemn awareness that there was no going back from this moment. Whatever happened next, whether we tried to rebuild or whether we ended things completely, we'd never be the same people we'd been 6 hours ago when we'd driven to that gala with our masks still firmly in place. When we got home, she followed me inside without speaking. The house felt different somehow, like the air itself had changed. We stood in the hallway, both of us still in our formal clothes that now felt ridiculous and constraining, and looked at each other like strangers trying to figure out what happens next. She started by saying she knew I probably didn't want to hear this right now, her voice raw from crying, but she was sorry. She was sorry for how she treated me. She was sorry for making me feel invisible. She was sorry for the note, for Clayton, for all of it. She knew she didn't deserve forgiveness, and she knew she'd broken something that might be impossible to fix, but she was truly, deeply sorry. I studied her face looking for signs of manipulation or performance. But what I saw looked genuine. She looked shattered in a way that went deeper than embarrassment or wounded pride. She looked like someone who was finally understanding the magnitude of what she'd lost. I told her that sorry was a start, but it was only words. Words were cheap. She'd spent months showing me through her actions that I didn't matter to her. She was going to have to show me through her actions that she was actually sorry, not just sorry she got caught. She nodded frantically, saying she would do whatever it took. She'd quit her job if that was what I wanted. She'd never speak to Clayton again. She'd go to counseling, couples therapy, whatever I thought we needed. She begged me not to give up on us yet. I walked to the guest bedroom door and opened it. The room was neat and impersonal, the way guest rooms always are, with its generic bedding and empty dresser drawers. I gestured inside and told her this was where she would sleep tonight. Her face crumpled and she started to protest. I interrupted, telling her this wasn't punishment. This was me establishing boundaries that should have existed months ago. This was me saying that physical intimacy and emotional intimacy were connected, and she couldn't have one without rebuilding the other. This was me refusing to share a bed with someone who treated me like an inconvenience when the lights were off. I saw her absorb this, saw her nod slowly even as fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. She said she understood. She would sleep in here. I continued, telling her that tomorrow we would start figuring out if this marriage was worth saving or if we were just delaying the inevitable. We would talk about everything. No more avoiding. No more pretending. No more protecting her comfort at the expense of my dignity. We would get honest, brutally honest, about what we both wanted and whether those wants were compatible. And if they weren't, we would end this like adults. She said quickly that they were compatible. Her wants were compatible with mine. She wanted to be my wife, really be my wife, not just in name. She wanted to rebuild what we had. I cut her off, telling her that what she wanted in this moment, when she was scared and facing consequences, might be very different from what she wanted when the dust settled and she remembered how good Clayton's attention felt. So we weren't making any decisions tonight. We weren't making promises we might not keep. We were just acknowledging that everything was broken, and if we were going to fix it, it was going to take time and work and consistent effort. She stood in the doorway of the guest room, looking small and lost in her expensive dress. She asked if she could ask me something. I asked what. She wanted to know why I hadn't just left. When I found the note, when I knew what was happening, why hadn't I just filed for divorce and been done with it? Why go through tonight? It was a fair question. I'd asked myself the same thing multiple times over the past week. I told her finally that leaving would have been easy, and it would have let her keep believing that she was the victim, that I was the one who gave up, that the failure of our marriage was somehow a mutual thing instead of something she actively created. I'd needed her to see herself clearly, even if it was just for a moment. I'd needed her to understand that actions have consequences, that she couldn't treat people like they were disposable and expect them to stick around forever. And I'd needed to prove to myself that I still had enough self-respect to stand up and say no when someone was using me. She absorbed this, nodding slowly. She suggested that I could have just talked to her, that I could have told her how I was feeling. I challenged her on this. Could I have? Really? Because I distinctly remembered trying to touch her shoulder on the couch, and she'd shaken me off like I was contaminated. I remembered trying to start conversations, and she'd picked up her phone instead. I remembered suggesting date nights, and she'd suddenly had urgent work commitments. She'd made it very clear that she didn't want my attention, my touch, or my presence in any meaningful way. So no, I didn't think talking would have worked. I thought she'd needed a shock to the system, and that was what tonight had been. She had no response to that, because we both knew it was true. I told her goodnight, turning toward our bedroom, the one that would now be just mine. I added that we'd talk more in the morning. I closed the door behind me and stood in the middle of the room, surrounded by the physical evidence of our shared life. Her perfume bottles on the dresser, her clothes in half the closet, her books on the nightstand. All of it would need to be moved to the guest room if this arrangement became permanent. All of it would need to be reorganized, redistributed, claimed, or abandoned. I got undressed slowly, hanging the charcoal suit that had felt like armor just hours ago. I washed my face, brushed my teeth, went through the mechanical motions of preparing for sleep. And then I lay down in the bed that suddenly felt enormous and empty, staring at the ceiling in the darkness. I thought I'd feel triumphant. I thought I'd feel vindicated or satisfied, or at least certain that I'd made the right choice. But instead, I just felt tired. Bone deep, soul-weary tired from months of fighting a losing battle against invisibility and irrelevance in my own marriage. But underneath the exhaustion, there was something else. Something that felt like the early stages of peace. Not happiness, not yet, maybe not for a long time, but a sense that I'd finally stopped accepting the unacceptable. That I'd finally drawn boundaries that should have existed from the beginning. That I'd finally stood up and said this was not okay, and I would not pretend it was. Whether Maggie would do the work to rebuild what she'd broken remained to be seen. Whether our marriage could survive this kind of fundamental betrayal was an open question. Whether we'd be stronger for having confronted this mess, or whether it was just the beginning of a long, painful end, I honestly didn't know. But I knew this. I would never again live as a ghost in my own house. I would never again accept being treated as an afterthought by the person who was supposed to love me most. I would never again prioritize someone else's comfort over my own dignity and self-respect. The road ahead would be difficult. There would be hard conversations and painful decisions, and moments where giving up felt easier than pushing forward. There would be lawyers and therapists and family members who'd want to weigh in with opinions and judgments. There would be gossip from Maggie's colleagues and awkward social situations, and the inevitable reconstruction of our social circles as people took sides or tried to maintain relationships with both of us. But all of that was tomorrow's problem. Tonight, for the first time in 6 months, I'd reclaimed something essential. I'd stopped being invisible. I'd stopped being passive. I'd stopped waiting for someone else to value me and started valuing myself instead. I closed my eyes and let sleep come, knowing that when I woke up, nothing would be resolved, but everything would be different. The performance was over. The masks were off. Whatever happened next would at least be real. And somehow, despite everything, that felt like enough. Sleep didn't come easily. I lay there in the darkness, my mind refusing to shut down despite the physical exhaustion. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw flashes from the evening. Maggie's face when I refused to dance. The way Clayton had stepped back when he saw the look in my eyes. The collective gasp from the crowd when I'd mentioned the note. The whispered conversations that had exploded the moment I'd walked away. Around 3 in the morning, I heard movement in the hallway. Soft footsteps, hesitant and careful. They stopped outside my door. I could see the shadow of feet in the strip of light under the doorframe. She stood there for what must have been 5 minutes, and I knew she was debating whether to knock, whether to try one more time to talk her way back into the bed, back into the comfort zone where she could pretend nothing fundamental had changed. But she didn't knock. Eventually, the shadow moved away, back toward the guest room. I heard her door close with a soft click that somehow felt louder than a slam would have been. That restraint, that acceptance of the boundary I'd set, told me something important. Maybe she was finally starting to understand that this wasn't a negotiation. This was a reckoning. When morning light finally started filtering through the curtains, I gave up on sleep entirely. I got up, showered, dressed in jeans and a comfortable shirt, the kind of casual clothes I'd have worn on a normal Sunday before our marriage had become this calculated battlefield. I went downstairs and started making coffee, the familiar ritual grounding me in something normal and routine. I was sitting at the kitchen table when Maggie appeared in the doorway. She'd changed out of the emerald dress into sweatpants and one of my old college hoodies, which struck me as either a calculated move to look vulnerable and non-threatening, or a genuine desire for comfort from something that used to represent us. Her face was clean of makeup, showing the puffy eyes and blotchy skin that came from crying most of the night. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail. She looked younger like this, more like the woman I'd married, and that made everything harder. She asked quietly if she could have some coffee, her voice hoarse. I gestured to the pot without speaking. She poured herself a cup and sat down across from me at the table. The same table where we'd shared thousands of meals over the years. The silence stretched between us, heavy with all the things that needed to be said and all the things that could never be unsaid. She finally broke the silence, staring into her coffee cup like it held answers. Her phone had been going crazy since she woke up, she told me. 37 messages from coworkers, 12 missed calls, 3 voicemails from her boss asking her to call as soon as possible. Everyone wanted to know what happened. Whether she was okay, whether we were getting divorced. Someone had already started a thread in the company Slack channel speculating about the drama. I took a sip of my coffee and said nothing. This was her reality to deal with, the natural consequence of treating her marriage like it was less important than her professional image. I wasn't going to make it easier for her by offering sympathy or suggesting damage control strategies. She continued in a voice barely above a whisper, telling me that Clayton had texted her too. 3 times, wanting to know if she was okay, asking if there was anything he could do, saying he felt terrible about what happened and that he never meant to cause problems in my marriage. I repeated the phrase back to her slowly, letting the words hang there. Never meant to cause problems. Interesting choice of phrasing, I noted. Not that he was sorry for crossing boundaries with a married woman. Not that he regretted pursuing someone who wasn't available. Just that he never meant to cause problems. Like the whole thing was some accidental misunderstanding instead of a deliberate choice they'd both made repeatedly over months. She flinched at the harshness in my voice but didn't defend him. Progress, maybe. She told me she'd instructed him not to contact her anymore. She'd blocked his number. She was going to request a transfer to a different department tomorrow, or if that wasn't possible, she'd start looking for a new job. She knew that didn't fix anything. And she knew actions mattered more than words. But she wanted me to know that she was serious about this, about us, about trying to rebuild what she'd broken. I studied her across the table, looking for signs of performance, for the calculation I'd seen so often in her eyes lately. But what I saw was exhaustion and fear, and something that might have been genuine remorse. Or maybe I just wanted to see those things because the alternative, accepting that our marriage was truly over, was too big and too final to face on a Sunday morning over coffee. I set my cup down carefully and told her what I needed her to understand. What happened last night at that gala wasn't the problem, I explained. It was the symptom. The problem was that she'd been slowly killing this marriage for months, taking little pieces of us and giving them away to someone else, treating me like I was an obligation instead of a partner. And the most insulting part was that she'd expected me to just accept it, to smile and play along and never call her out on it. She'd expected me to be complicit in my own erasure. She told me she knew, and her voice broke on the words. She knew she'd done all of that. She knew she'd been selfish and cruel and thoughtless. She'd convinced herself that she could have both things, that she could pursue this connection with Clayton while still maintaining the comfortable stability of our marriage. She'd told herself that it wasn't really cheating because they weren't sleeping together, that it was just friendship, just professional admiration. But that was a lie she told herself to avoid facing what she was actually doing. She took a shaky breath and continued. The truth was that she'd been scared, she admitted. Scared of being ordinary, scared of being just another marketing executive in just another marriage with just another suburban life. Clayton had made her feel exciting again, like she was someone worth pursuing, someone interesting and desirable instead of just someone's wife. And she'd chased that feeling like an addict, not caring what it cost, not caring what it cost me. It was the most honest thing she'd said to me in months, maybe years, and part of me appreciated the raw vulnerability of it. But another part of me, the part that had been systematically hurt and dismissed for half a year, needed more than a confession. I needed to see if she understood the full scope of the damage. I leaned forward and asked if she knew what the worst part was. It wasn't finding the note, I told her. It wasn't even watching her light up around him while looking through me like I was furniture. The worst part was that moment on the couch when she'd physically recoiled from my touch. That single gesture had told me everything I needed to know about how she really felt about me. She hadn't just fallen out of love with me. She'd started finding my presence repulsive, and that kind of contempt didn't develop overnight. That was something that built over time, something she'd nurtured and let grow until it became her default response to me. Tears were streaming down her face now, but she didn't look away. She said I was right. She'd done that. She'd let herself pull away from me bit by bit, convincing herself that the distance was about her needing space or being stressed about work, when really she was just making room for someone else. And then she'd resented me for not fighting harder to close that distance, which was completely unfair because she was the one who kept pushing me away. My phone buzzed on the table between us. I glanced down and saw a text from Marcus, my best friend since college. He'd been at the gala last night with his wife, standing close enough to witness at least some of the confrontation. The message was simple, asking if I wanted to get coffee or beer or whatever I needed, letting me know he was there for me. Maggie saw me looking at the phone. She said quietly that people were going to take sides. My friends, her friends, our families. This was going to get messy in ways we couldn't control. I replied that it was always going to get messy. The question was whether we were going through this mess as two people trying to save something worth saving, or as two people who were finally admitting that we'd already lost it. And I genuinely didn't know the answer to that question yet. She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup like she was trying to absorb its warmth. She asked what it would take for me to believe that she was serious about fixing this, for me to want to try. It was a fair question, and I forced myself to really consider it instead of giving an automatic answer. What would it take? What would be enough to make me believe that we could rebuild trust after it had been so thoroughly demolished? I told her finally that it would take time. Consistent actions over an extended period that proved her words weren't just panic talking. Therapy, both individual and couples, because we clearly had fundamental issues in how we communicated and prioritized each other. Complete transparency, no more secrets or hidden conversations or deleted messages. And most importantly, she had to want to do this work for the right reasons. Not because she was scared of being divorced or worried about what people would think or concerned about the financial implications, but because she actually valued our relationship enough to fight for it. She nodded, absorbing each point. She told me she could do all of that. She would do all of that. I challenged her on this. Could she? Because it was easy to make promises on a Sunday morning when she was scared and facing consequences. It was a lot harder to follow through 6 months from now when the immediate crisis had passed and someone else started giving her attention that felt exciting and new. How did I know she wouldn't just repeat this pattern the next time our marriage hit a rough patch, or she felt underappreciated, or someone at work started sending her notes? The question hung between us, brutal and necessary, because that was the real issue underneath everything else. Not just whether she was sorry, but whether she was capable of being the kind of partner I needed and deserved. She said finally that I didn't know, meeting my eyes with a directness I hadn't seen in months. She couldn't prove to me right now that she wouldn't make the same mistakes again. All she could tell me was that what happened last night terrified her in a way she'd never experienced before. Not just the public humiliation, though that was awful, but seeing the look in my eyes when I refused to dance with her. That complete lack of warmth or connection or hope. It was like looking at a stranger who used to love her, but didn't anymore. And realizing that she did that she killed whatever we had through her own selfishness and stupidity, that might be the worst feeling she'd ever experienced. Before I could respond, the doorbell rang. We both froze, looking at each other with matching expressions of dread. Neither of us was in any state to deal with visitors, and given the events of last night, unexpected guests could only mean more complications. I got up and walked to the front door, checking the peephole. My stomach dropped. Standing on our porch, looking uncomfortable but determined, was Jennifer Martin, Maggie's boss and the senior vice president of the marketing firm. She was still in casual weekend clothes, jeans and a blazer, but her presence on our doorstep on a Sunday morning meant this was serious. I opened the door and greeted her by name. She returned the greeting with a tight smile, apologizing for showing up unannounced like this. Maggie hadn't been answering her phone, she explained, and they needed to have a conversation. She asked if Maggie was available. Maggie had appeared behind me in the hallway, her face going even paler when she saw who was at the door. She started to apologize, saying she'd seen the calls but was going to reach out tomorrow. Jennifer interrupted, not unkindly but with an authority that made it clear this wasn't really a question. She asked if she could come in. We stepped aside and let her in. The three of us ended up back in the kitchen, which suddenly felt too small for the tension filling it. Jennifer declined the offer of coffee and got straight to the point. She began by saying she wasn't here to pry into our personal life. What happened in our marriage was between Maggie and me. But what happened at the gala last night stopped being purely personal the moment it happened in front of clients, partners, and the entire executive team. They'd already had 3 calls this morning from people who attended, wanting to know how the firm was handling the situation. The Slack channel conversation that had started last night had spiraled into something that was affecting team morale and productivity. Maggie's face had gone from pale to ashen. She said she understood and would send an email to the team apologizing for the disruption and explaining that it was a personal matter that shouldn't have happened at a professional event. Jennifer agreed that was a start, but they needed to talk about Clayton Hayes. The name landed like a bomb in the kitchen. I watched Maggie's hands clench on the table, saw her struggle to maintain composure. Jennifer continued, her voice professional, but not without sympathy. Several people had approached her last night after we left, expressing concern about inappropriate workplace relationships. She needed to be very clear about this. If there had been any romantic or sexual involvement between Maggie and Clayton, that was a serious violation of company policies given their positions and the reporting structures involved. Maggie said quickly that there wasn't, her voice desperate. They'd never crossed that line. It was just that they'd become close, too close. But they'd never slept together or even kissed. It was emotional, not physical. Jennifer studied her for a long moment, saying she wanted to believe that. Maggie had been a valuable member of their team for 5 years, and her work had consistently been excellent. But perception mattered in this industry. And right now, the perception was that she'd been engaged in an inappropriate relationship with a colleague while using company events to facilitate that relationship. That was a problem for her, for the firm's reputation, and for Maggie's career trajectory. I found myself speaking before I'd consciously decided to. I mentioned that Clayton had texted Maggie this morning, multiple times, checking in on her, asking if she was okay, saying he felt terrible about causing problems. That didn't sound like someone who kept things purely professional. Jennifer's expression hardened as she asked if that was true. Maggie nodded miserably, confirming that yes, it was true. But she'd blocked his number this morning, and she was planning to request a transfer or start looking for other opportunities because she knew they couldn't work together anymore. Jennifer said that wouldn't be necessary, and something in her tone made both Maggie and I look up sharply. Clayton Hayes had submitted his resignation via email at 6 that morning, she informed us. He'd be serving a 2-week notice period, during which he'd be working remotely and would have no direct contact with Maggie or anyone else from her department. The official explanation was that he was pursuing other opportunities, and she expected everyone involved to maintain that narrative. The news hit Maggie like a physical blow. Whatever remnants of the fantasy she'd been building with Clayton, they evaporated in that moment. He'd quit rather than face the consequences of what had happened. He'd run away, leaving her to deal with the fallout alone. Jennifer stood up, preparing to leave. She told Maggie that she was being placed on administrative leave for 1 week, effective immediately. This wasn't a suspension, and it wouldn't affect her pay or benefits. But she needed time away from the office to handle her personal situation, and they needed time to let the gossip die down. When she returned, they'd have a formal meeting to discuss her role going forward and establish clear professional boundaries. Maggie thanked her in a whisper, saying she understood. Jennifer paused at the kitchen door, looking between the two of us. She said that for what it was worth, she hoped we could figure this out. Marriage was hard enough without making it harder on ourselves, but she added that whatever happened in Maggie's personal life, she needed to keep her professional life separate going forward. The firm had been very good to her. She shouldn't make them regret that investment. After she left, Maggie and I sat in silence. The house felt different now, heavier, like the walls themselves were pressing in on us. She was crying quietly, her shoulders shaking, and for the first time in months, I felt an instinct to comfort her. But I stayed in my seat, letting her process this new reality. She finally spoke, her voice barely audible. He'd quit, she said. He'd just run away. Left her to deal with all of this alone. I corrected her, saying that he'd protected himself, which was exactly what I told her he would do. Men like Clayton Hayes didn't sacrifice anything for the women they pursued. They chased the excitement and validation, and when it got complicated or messy or inconvenient, they disappeared. She'd meant something to him when she made him feel good about himself, but she'd never meant enough for him to stand beside her when things got hard. She looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw the moment when the fantasy finally shattered completely. Whatever she'd built up in her head about Clayton, about what they had or could have had, it dissolved in the face of his abandonment, and in its absence, she was left with the reality of what she'd risked and what she'd damaged to chase something that had never been real. She told me she was so sorry, and this time the apology felt different. Not performative or defensive, but broken and genuine. She'd thrown away something real for something imaginary, she admitted. She'd thrown away someone who would have stood by her through anything for someone who couldn't even stand by her for a single morning. She was so incredibly sorry, and she understood if that wasn't enough. I stood up and walked to the kitchen window, looking out at our backyard, where we'd once talked about building a deck and planting a garden and hosting summer barbecues with friends. Those plans felt like they belonged to different people, to a version of us that might not exist anymore. I told her, without turning around, that I needed time. Not a day or a week, but real time to figure out if I could forgive this, if I could trust her again, if I even wanted to. And she needed to be okay with that uncertainty. She needed to be okay with doing the work of rebuilding without any guarantee that it would be enough. She said she understood. She would do whatever it took, for however long it took. I turned to face her and laid out what would happen starting tomorrow. She was going to find a therapist, I told her. Not a couples counselor yet, but an individual therapist who could help her understand why she did this. Because until she understood her own patterns and triggers, until she could identify what made her vulnerable to this kind of behavior, we couldn't even begin to address the relationship issues. She nodded, pulling out her phone to make a note. She said she would start calling therapists that afternoon. I continued, telling her I was going to talk to Marcus. I needed perspective from someone I trusted, someone who wasn't emotionally invested in the outcome. I needed to be able to process what happened without worrying about her feelings or managing her guilt. She told me, of course, whatever I needed. We stood there in the kitchen, two people who'd promised to love each other forever, now separated by a chasm that might be too wide to cross. The morning sun was streaming through the windows now, harsh and revealing, showing every crack in the foundation we'd built our lives on. I walked past her toward the stairs, then stopped and turned back. She looked up at me with those red, swollen eyes, waiting for some sign of forgiveness or hope.